Yeah. Thanks for your time. We'll again catch up. Yep. Jamit, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to mute myself. No, before that, let me introduce. Hi, everyone. This is machine learning using Python, support vector machines. This is the session 14 and module 8, part 1, being handled by Jamie Tosawa, our instructor. Jamie, please take over from here. Thank you very much. And I'll put myself in the mute mode.
So thank you, sir, for the introduction. And hi, everyone. This is machine learning using Python. And today's topic is support vector machines, module 8.1 and session 14. So let's discuss the learning objective for this session. We'll first introduce ourselves with the support vector machines. What are they? How they work on different kinds of data, and what are the applications of them in the fields. So when we talk about the general ML categories, supervised, unsupervised, and reinforced learning, the support vector machines fall under supervised learning. So what is a support vector machine? What are support vector machines? So it's a supervised machine learning algorithm that classifies data by finding an optimal line or something called as hyperplane that maximizes the distance between each class in an n-dimensional space. So it was first developed by Vladimir Vapnik in 1990s, and it was published in a paper titled Support Vector Method for Function Approximation, Regression Estimation, and Signal Processing in 1995. So you can see the pictorial representation of SVMs. There are two images, that is, one is appearing on the left and the other image on the right. You can see that there are a bunch of contents, parts of the SVMs that are being labeled on the image on the left. There is something called as hyperplane, support vectors, margin, class 1 and class 2. Class 1 and class 2 are nothing but the classes that the data points belong to. So we'll learn them as we go. And so what is the use of SVM? So though SVMs are mostly used for classification tasks, it can also be used for regression tasks. Though SVMs are best suited for classification tasks. How do they work? The algorithm is to identify the optimal hyperplane in an n-dimensional space that can effectively separate data points into different classes in a feature space. Now you can see something similar in the image below, that the hyperplane is depicted with a red dotted line, whereas two black parallel lines are drawn, which are called as margin lines. And support vectors are the data points that when margin line passes through these data points, which are closest to the hyperplane, are called support vectors. The margin is the distance of margin line from the hyperplane, and margin width is the distance of between the two margin lines that are existing. So you can see that how a hyperplane is separating the two classes that are existing. The one class can be yellow dots and the other class being blue triangles. So hyperplane separates those two classes in the space that they are plotted. So how are SVM used? As mentioned, they can be used for both regression and classification problems, but they are best suited for classification problems. So the number of features in the input data determine how the hyperplane is going to be. So if the hyperplane is a line in a 2D space or a plane in an n-dimensional space, since the multiple hyperplanes can be found to differentiate classes, maximizing the margin between points enables the algorithm to find the best decision boundary between classes. So the lines that are adjacent to the optimal hyperplane are known as the margin lines, and the data points that lie on these lines are called support vectors. These support vectors determine the maximum margin and help the model generalize the data very well. So when we are plotting the data on just a line in a 1D space, our hyperplane is a point. When we plot the data in a 2D space, our hyperplane is a line separating the two classes. And when we uh, plot the data in a 3D space, our hyperplane becomes a plane in a 2D space. So even though SVM is not limited to binary classification, but it will be discussed in binary binary classification in this session. So there are so now we'll be discussing the types of SVM classifiers. So first, you can see that till now we have discussed SVM in the image that is shown on the left. That is linearly separable data points. We can easily find whether easy or not, but we can find a line that can separate the two classes completely. So the data points are called linearly separable data points. But so we know about how SVMs work in linearly separable scenarios. But what if the scenario is something like the image on the right, where the data points are not linearly separable? So to start with the types of SVM classifiers, we'll start with linear SVMs, which deals with linearly separable data. So here, the data points do not undergo any kind of transformation to separate the data into different classes. So the decision boundary and the support vectors form the appearance of a street. You can see that this analogy is used by Professor Patrick Winston from MIT. And he uses this analogy of fitting the widest possible street. So you can see why he says that when there is a hyperplane, on the image on the left, there is a hyperplane, and there are margin lines being constructed which passes through the support vectors. And this gives a depiction of a street. So that is why the analogy says, analogy of the professor says that fitting the widest possible street. Now this helps the machine learning algorithm to classify the data well for both the classes. And the point of the SVM is to keep those data points off the streets. So continuing to that analogy, we can keep them off the streets. So that's what they mean. They are off from the street-like structure that is formed. So moving further with the linear SVMs, and mathematically speaking, the hyperplane is represented by Wx plus b equals to 0. And now the linear SVMs have two subtypes, which can be called as hard margin SVMs and soft margin SVMs. So hard margin SVMs are the data points are where the data points will be perfectly separated outside the support vectors, which is represented by the formula Wxj plus b. into yj, which is greater than a. Now, here w is the weight of the weight vector that defines the orientation of the hyperplane. Xj is the feature vector representing a specific data point. B is the bias term that shifts the hyperplane away from the origin, and yj is the label of the data point. Now, as the yj is the label of the data point, it is typically used as +1 for the positive class and -1 for the negative class. Lastly, a is the constant that is usually represents the margin, which is often set to 1 for the hard margin SVMs. So the margin is supposed to be maximized. We are trying to find the margins with the most distance or the widest distance. So that is represented by gamma equals to A by the magnitude of W, where A is the margin projected onto W. Now, for soft margin SVMs, the classification is more flexible, which allows some kind of some misclassification through the use of slack variables and hyperparameter denoted by C. So, what are these slack variables and hyperparameter? So, starting with the slack variables and the soft margin SVMs, for each training example, the the slack variable quantifies the degree of misclassification if the data point is within the margin or on the wrong side of the decision boundary. Its corresponding slack variable will be greater than 0. The goal is to minimize the sum of these slack variables to control the number of misclassifications while also maximizing the margin. And the other thing is my hyperparameter C. The support vector machine optimization problem balances maximizing the margin and minimizing the sum of slack variables, which is controlled by the parameter C. A higher C value emphasizes correct classification over margin width, while a lower C value allows more misclassification over a wider margin. So the value of C plays a vital role in it, and there is a trade-off that exists between maximizing the margin and minimizing the misclassification. So a larger C value results in narrower margin, emphasizing models priority on correct classification and minimizing the amount of misclassified data. On the other hand, a smaller value of C allows a wider margin, enabling the model to tolerate more misclassification in favor of more generalized decision boundary. So slack variable and the hyperparameter C work together to create a balance between margin size and the potential for misclassification in the soft margin SVMs. Now, those were the types of linearly separable SVMs working with a linearly separable data. The second type is non-linear SVMs, which work with data of a non-linearly separable data. So you can see that in the first image, we have plotted the data points on the number line, and it is not a linearly separable data. So what we do when we are working with such a data or non-linearly separable data, we transform the data into higher dimensions when we can find a plane. So you can see in the case of first image, we are transforming the data points into higher dimensions, and where we can find a hyperplane which separates both the negative and the positive classes. So that is how SVMs work with a non-linear data. Now, in the second case, the data has been mapped on a 2D space. So our hyperplane is going to be, so when we transform the data into 3D space, our hyperplane is going to be a 2D plane, or a plane basically. So when we work with non-linear data, the general idea is to transform the data and map it into a higher dimensional feature space where the training set is separable. And you can see how in the 2D space, the data points are transformed into 3D space, and a plane is hyperplane is created, which separates both the negative and the positive classes. So when the data is linearly separable, kernel functions are used to transform the data to higher dimensional space to enable linear separation. This application of kernel functions can be known as kernel trick. Now, depending on the use case and the data characteristics, there are different kernels that are available, which are linear kernels, polynomial kernels, radial basis function kernels, or sigmoid kernels. The third type of SVM classifier is support vector regressions. Now, remember when we talked about SVM being able to work with a regression as well as classification task, but is best suited for classification. But support vector regression is an extension of SVMs, which is which is used for regression problems. And similar to support vector machines, support vector regression finds a hyperplane with the maximum margin between data points and is typically used for time series prediction. Now, SVR differs from the linear regression, where in linear regression we define the relationship between the dependent and the independent variables. Here in SVR, the relationship is determined by, on its own by the SVR. So, as we have discussed the SVMs, so let's discuss SVMs theoretically and with other supervised learning classifiers. Starting with support vector machines versus logistic regression. Though SVMs are better at high dimensional data and unstructured data such as image and text compared to the logistic regression, SVMs are less sensitive to overfitting and easier to interpret, but they are computationally expensive. Comparing SVMs with decision trees, as pointed before, that they are good with high dimensional data and are less prone to overfitting. The decision trees are faster to train, and particularly with smaller data sets, they are generally easier to interpret as well. And you can say that because you can see where the decision trees are making splits on based on what conditions. Moving further with SVMs versus naive Bayes, both naive Bayes and SVMs are used for text classification tasks, and SVMs tend to perform better than naive Bayes on non-linearly separable data. But SVMs have something called SVMs have to be tuned for different values of hyperparameters, and this can be a computationally expensive task. The other comparison that we are going to make is for SVMs and neural networks, where SVMs are computationally expensive to train and less prone to overfitting. The neural networks are considered more flexible and scalable compared to SVMs. So these were the theoretical comparisons between SVMs and other supervised learning classifiers. Now let's look at some of the some of the applications of the support vector machines. The first is the text classification, where they are used for uses as sentiment analysis, spam detection, and topic modeling, where they lend themselves to these data as they perform well with high dimensional data. The other application is image classification, where it can be used for object detection, image retrieval, and can also be used in security domains, whether the image has been tampered with or not. In bioinformatics, it can be used for classification of protein classification, gene expression analysis, and disease diagnosis. SVMs are also used in cancer research because they can detect subtle trends in complex data sets. The fourth use is a geographic information system, where geophysical structure underground filter, where analyzing of layered geophysical structures underground, filtering out the noise from the electromagnetic data. They also help out in seismic liquefaction potential of soil, which is relevant to field of civil engineering. Seismic liquefaction potential is nothing but soil losing its ability to uh, uh, its strength, and acts like a liquid uh, in the moments of earthquake and stuff. So it's basically the strength of the soil, and this helps in the field of civil engineering with the for building different structures or so. To summarize this session, we started with support vector machines, and we saw how they work. They create a hyperplane which separates the two classes, and we try to make uh, the widest margins possible with the help of support vectors, and the support vectors decide the orientation of the hyperplane as well. Now, the next thing we discussed was how they work with linearly separable data and non-linearly separable data. For non-linearly separable data, it works by uh, transforming the data in and mapping them into higher dimensional space with the help of kernel tricks, and there are different kernels available. Then we discussed about different types of SVMs, linear SVMs and non-linear SVMs. Then in linear, we discussed about hard margin SVMs and soft margin SVMs. And also we discussed about support vector regressions, which were the extension of support vector machines. Then we did a theoretical comparison of SVMs with other classifiers such as logistic regression, nearby neural networks and stuff. In the end, we discussed about the applications of SVMs in different fields. So yeah, this was for the support vector machines on session 14. So thanks a lot for listening. Also, these were the references that were used uh, for this presentation.
Jamie? Or things?
Hello?
Yeah, everything is fine?
Yeah. Yeah. The presentation is done.
Okay. Hey, thank you, Jamie, for the presentation. And I will stop the recording here, and we look forward to next session on Friday. Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. Just I'll stop the recording.